Great. Good afternoon. We'll give everyone a minute or two to join us and then we'll get started. For those who just joined us, we're going to give everyone just a little bit of time to dial in and then we will get started. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jenna Talbot, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors, and I have the pleasure of working alongside the Strata Center for Consumer Insights. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look at some of the data collected through Public Viewpoints, which is Strata's new weekly survey that's looking at the impact of COVID-19 on Americans' work and education. This is building on Strata's longstanding work to elevate the perspectives of education consumers when we talk about the intersection of post-secondary education and work. And this survey specifically is designed to bring to light those perspectives to really help inform our understanding of this rapidly changing world and eventually the road to recovery. When Strata launched the survey a couple of weeks ago, we had a webinar, which I believe many of you joined us, and we heard overwhelmingly an interest in understanding the data broken down by race and ethnicity. So this week's findings are an analysis based on 4 weeks of data around race and ethnicity. So we'll get into that very quickly. And then we're really excited to have a conversation with Deborah Santiago of Excellencia in Education and Brian Bridges of the United Negro College Fund, really to talk through some of the context and what we might be seeing in the data. So just a couple of notes before we get started. The complete deck is available at strataeducation.org/public viewpoint. We're also tracking each week's data on a weekly basis so you can see trends and change in responses. Today, of course, would welcome your questions. We want to have a robust conversation here. So please enter any questions you have in the Q&A section down at the bottom. Please include your name and affiliation. We had a great group joining us last week and we'd love to bring everyone into the conversation. And of course, if you prefer to ask a question anonymously, you can certainly do so as well. With that, I will turn it over to Dave Clayton, who is the Senior Vice President leading the Center for Consumer Insights. Dave, thanks for taking it away.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you, Nicole, my colleague at the Center for Consumer Insights. And I really had some meaningful conversations even in the last 2 days as we've been reflecting on the learnings and insights. And I'm delighted you'll be able to hear from them and interact together after we share an overview. There are a lot of other people who've worked a lot of hours and put this together. Really, as Jenna said, we have a national dialogue about disproportionate impact, right, in health and in different ways. And our survey allows us to look at that impact with regard to some texture in people's work lives and the impact they're experiencing, as well as in their expectations for education. And so at this point, we're in a position where we can come back to you. As Jenna said, we have a weekly survey and we release results every Wednesday, even when there's not a webinar. Last week, for example, we looked at generational differences and saw that millennials report the greatest impact on their work lives, and along with Gen X are the ones who feel most likely that they need additional education to replace work and jobs. And so, you know, we track each week and we add new questions and let go of some old ones. But what we're able to do today and what we'll focus on is over the last 4 weeks, we've had 4,000 people respond to the survey and participate. And what that means is we aggregate and look at the experience of Americans in the past month. We have 474 Black Americans who participated in the survey, 610 Hispanic Americans, 223 Asian Americans, and 2,600 white Americans. And so we'll be looking at those groups today and the differences in their experience and similarities as we've gone through this. You know, some things have stayed steady and the same with slight declines. And that's interesting, and what's really sobering news that we'll look at today as we think about this, where, you know, you think it's good news that 48% of Americans are only worried about are worried about the financial impact compared to the 56% 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so there's a slight decline, but really overall concern and chronic thing. The one piece of good news that we don't have a slide on, but as we think about unexpected positives, people's expectations about the impact of COVID-19 on their relationships has improved. Expectations about a positive benefit for relationships with children, relationships with partners, relationships with family are all 15 percentage points higher than they were 5 weeks ago. And that's the one place where consistently Americans are saying things are better than I thought they would be in my most personal relationships. I guess our hope with yours is that we can take that out of our homes and out of our families and into our communities and into our nation, that we can work together to make things better for individual lives and for all of us. So let us share what we're seeing, and let's work together to that end. The same time that we're talking about group averages and group differences, we know that individuals are not averages and they're not numbers, and grateful for Brian and Deborah and the work they and their colleagues do on the front lines of helping people. And so we're in the organizations that they serve and are part of their membership. So we appreciate their participation with us today. We'll touch on 5 broad themes. Nicole will talk to us about work. I'll talk a little about education, and then we'll open up to your questions and discussion. But the impact, while widespread, we still see disproportionate impact on people of color. When you look at all the ways in which people could report having lost income from work, whether it's being laid off or having hours reduced or shifts changed or just wages paid, Latino Americans in the aggregate are the most likely to say most widespread, most likely to say they have lost some income in some way from their work. Black Americans are the most likely to say they've actually been laid off and had their jobs terminated in that way. When you talk about education expectations, Asian and Latino Americans are more likely than white and Black Americans to say, if I need to replace a job and find a new one that's the same, not get ahead, but a comparable job, I'm going to need more education or training to do that, to stay level, to make a lateral move, so to speak. And then we would look at where people would prefer to invest resources in their additional education. And we see that online remains predominant. But there are some preferences emerging amongst groups, and we'll monitor those and see how those hold over time as we navigate through this. But Nicole, do you want to go ahead and talk to us a little bit about some of those insights into the work disruption and experiences?
Yep. Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. And so there are a few different ways we're going to look at this. So as Dave mentioned, we've been seeing the trends, and there's no group that's escaping this. We've seen that the impact of COVID-19 in terms of people's work has been high across all groups. However, even within that, we see that people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the economic effects of this crisis. So the first thing, this is a statistic we've been tracking over several weeks in terms of how many people are worried that they'll lose their jobs. And so this is something that you don't see captured by the unemployment numbers, as awful as those are. These are among people who still have jobs, who still are employed. But we see, even with a slight decline, that still about 6 in 10 Americans say that they're worried that they'll lose their job due to the COVID-19 crisis. So then within that, we look across these different groups, and we really see a difference between white Americans and people of color. So as you can see, it's about 70% of Asian Americans, Black Americans, and Latino Americans who say that they're worried about losing their jobs. It's just a really high number here. And so we know that, that takes a toll even if you haven't already lost your job. So next, the next thing we look at that we've been tracking are how many people have experienced some kind of work impact. And so again, we see it's been pretty steady for the past couple of weeks, but this is still a very, very high number. The majority of Americans are reporting that they've either lost their jobs or had their hours reduced, their income reduced, some kind of negative impact on the income that they're bringing home from their work due to COVID-19. So this is, over 50%. And again, when we break this apart, we really see when we're aggregating all those different types of work impacts that Latino Americans have been the most impacted in total by these different types of work disruption. So there, this includes people who have lost their jobs or people who have had their hours or their income reduced in some way. So this is kind of an aggregate number, and we know that there are different situations. And so just kind of picking that apart in the next couple of slides, we look at who's been laid off. So here we see a little bit of a distinction here. We see that Black Americans are the most likely to say that they've been laid off, that they've lost their job completely due to this crisis. They're followed very closely by Latino Americans. And so that's, as we continue to track this, those are pretty close statistics. But we see definitely a distinction between these groups and white and Asian Americans. We see about a 10 percentage point difference in people who have lost their jobs completely. And then the next aspect of it, for those that may not necessarily have lost their jobs, but they have had their hours reduced, their shifts reduced, again, that's where we see the different impact on the Latino community. They're about, 5 points, 6 points higher than whites and, almost 10 points higher than other groups. So everyone is having this impact, but it's just a little bit distinct between the two communities. And finally, we know that this crisis has been really impacting small businesses, and that there are many small businesses around the country owned by people of color. And so when we look specifically at those who own a business and the impact that we see on their income, Dave, if we can move on, there we go, that we see that Latino Americans who own businesses, about 4 out of every 5 say that their income has been reduced during this crisis out of business owners. We see a really high, again, a high impact across the board. I mean, 2/3 of everyone who owns a business is saying that they've lost income, but even more intense among Latino Americans and the next among Asian Americans. So in our next section, we're gonna move on from work to talk more about the education impact. So if we're seeing such widespread disruption in terms of work, people losing their jobs, losing their income, being afraid of losing their jobs, where are people turning next? And what are they thinking of when they're looking for a solution? So we wanted to know if people are thinking about going back to school, if they think they'll need more education, or if they're thinking of changing careers. And if they were to get more education, what type of education would they look for? So that's the next section that Dave is going to lead us through.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you already for some of the questions that are coming to Jenna. I apologize. We're using the term Latino American. In the survey itself, people self-identify on their race or ethnicity, and the actual survey line is Hispanic, if people identify themselves as Hispanic. And so that sometimes is a federal term, and as Deborah and her colleagues at Excelencia focus on Latinos as individuals, we've chosen to use that term in the materials today. Hopefully that's helpful to recognize who we're talking and with in our surveys. As noted before, these perspectives on the future of education and the needs and the role it would play in their lives do vary across these groups. When you ask people, if I were to lose my job, I will need additional education or training to find another job with the same wages or income. This is not to advance or get ahead. This is to stay level. You see this need where really 1/3 of Americans feel they would need that additional education or training to stay level. if they lose a job with all that's going on. You see an increased likelihood amongst the Latino population, with 38% in that bar on the right saying, I agree or strongly agree that I will need additional education to stay level and secure a comparable job. 36% for Asian Americans and 31% Black Americans relative to whites, white Americans at the 33%. Then we start asking about, if you got that education or if you lost the job, what would you be looking in the same field? Do you not know where you would look? You have no idea? Or would you look to change careers? And so that becomes an issue of upskilling, reskilling, not knowing what's in front of you and needing direction for some of those who are unsure. And here again, we see that the Black American population is less likely to say they would want to change career fields if they were to lose their current employment. And then finally, we asked this question about, if you had $5,000 available to invest in your future education or training, where would you prefer to spend it? And you'll see across the bottom in that dark blue, 47% white Americans, 46% Asian, 52% Black Americans, 47% Latino Americans, an online preference. And so the vast majority look to the most popular preference is online. That includes online community colleges, online colleges and universities, and online courses or training with providers other than colleges or universities. So it's a combination, and each of those are 15 to 18 percentage points individually, but they all roll up into that preference for online, as opposed to the in-person, which would be in-person at a community college or in-person at a college or university, and then that top bar of employer-provided on-the-job training and preparation. You see a little bit of difference, just to note, amongst the Black and Latino American communities for a preference for in-person education. Again, this is early and the sample sizes are marginal, but you see this trend emerging, and we'll continue to monitor and track that and that interest and who is interested in that as we get farther down the road with the ability to look at different prior education experiences and what people are looking for now. And then also another emerging trend, just to note, is this lower levels slightly for interest in employer-provided training among Black Americans. So just in summary, you know, widespread but disproportionate impact for people of color, most likely to have lost income in some shape or form from their work, Latinos with 2/3 having that experience, complete layoff from the job they have, most likely for Black Americans. Latino and Asian Americans are more likely to believe they would need additional education to find a comparable job if they lose the one they have. And then this pervasive preference we saw previously and continue to see across communities of color for online education. But with that, Jenna, I'll turn it back to you and to our group for discussion.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And Brian and Deborah, thank you for joining us. Deborah, let's start with you. What stands out to you? We'll get into some specifics, but just at a high level, what stands out to you about this data?
So I guess first I'd say thank you for taking the survey on and looking at multiple populations, disaggregating to be able to tell a more nuanced story. I think it's important in how we think about our community overall, and then those who are kind of increasingly the backbone of our communities and what keeps our country strong. That is first. The second I'd say is that the economic impact and the work is something that really struck me. We often think about our community, hard workers, very represented in the labor force. And what this shows us is that we have an economic vulnerability we need to be addressing as a country overall. We have a representation of many people of color in blue collar jobs, salt of the earth kind of work that is also often low paying, but we're also seeing the entrepreneurial nature. So it really struck me to see the small business and the disproportionate representation of Latinos in their income loss, but also in small business. We know with data that we are very represented there, very entrepreneurial, and the impact of this pandemic and the uncertainty really has affected us. And yet that we see a commitment to education in the data that you also shared. And for once, I would love to just finally dispel this myth that Latinos don't value education. Time and again, we've known for years that's not the case. It still comes up in policy conversations. And when you ask them if they think they can get additional education, you're seeing the answer is yes. And that means that, to even maintain their standard of living, much less improve it, we know that education is core. Those really stood out to me. I think the last piece, and I know we're gonna have more of a conversation, is the recognition that this is the growth population in our country. And looking at what happens to us in the education and the workforce has significant implications for all of us, whether or not we're in this population. And thinking about policy and practice in that realm is really going to be important. That stood out to me.
Thank you.
And Deborah, I want to piggyback on something that you said about the value of education. First, I want to thank Strata for taking on this work because I know that there'll be lots of questions about how the data was parsed out and whether or not you can slice it certain ways. But some data is better than no data. So I appreciate the work that you guys have taken on to do this. When I think about the overarching implications of this work, it makes me think about how too often our education system has failed people of color. And that is not prepared them well for and appropriately for the changing and dynamic nature of work today and moving forward. And so I think that there are other implications that we'll get into a little more later. But for me, I think about the idea of being prepared to be upskilled and have career flexibility. And I also want to piggyback on what Deborah said around the value of education in these communities, because it's something that we still hear as well about around African Americans and their value for education, where some of our research shows that some of the lowest income communities value education more than the highest income communities. And so I hope that this helps to add to the narrative that these populations don't care about education. But for me, I'm not totally surprised by the disproportionate and negative impact toward African Americans and Latinos by the pandemic. What I am interested in is how do we take this data, help our institutions better prepare those populations to move forward in a more effective manner when we do come out on the other side, because I do believe that we will come to some sense of normal, whether it's a few weeks from now or several months from now. I want African American and Latino students to be well prepared once we get to that place. And thinking about now, how do they prepare themselves to take advantage of educational opportunities, whether they're online or not, when we're in a better position, or once we come out of the other side of the pandemic.
And Brian, when we first shared the data with you, I know you were struck by the finding that Black Americans are more likely than other groups to seek another job in their current career field versus considering other fields. What do you make of that, and why did that stand out to you?
Yeah, that stood out to me because it's at the intersection of this whole idea. We talk a lot about upskilling and being willing to pivot to different job paths and different career fields. And to me, given the changes going on in automation, with AI, artificial intelligence, and technology, and how they're influencing the way we work daily, new and refreshed skills are necessary on a constant basis. The Bureau of Labor Statistics did a survey. They released a study last year of baby boomers that showed that the average number of jobs they had was 12. And I know that there's some data since then that number is increasing exponentially for today's populations and today's generations. So this idea that colleges and universities can effectively help their students with soft skills, particularly around career flexibility and adaptability is something that we're trying to promote through UNCF's Career Pathways Initiative to help students understand that the job that they may get immediately out of college or the career field that they go into immediately out of college might be 2 or 3 removed from the career field they're in 20 years from now. So I think that adaptability is one that we have to help students embrace more wholeheartedly.
Deborah, I know a couple weeks ago, when we were just maybe a week or 2 into college closures, you held a town hall with some of your partner institutions and some of the students. What did you hear there? And as we think about the data shared today, where might there be some overlap?
Sure. So, we are very grateful that we have kind of a trust relationship with the institutions that we've been working with. And I will tell you, even March 19th is when we had it, the willingness to share what was working and the challenges they were facing concurrently with their students and with the faculty and as institutions overall was really striking. The commitment, the innovation is something that we don't lose sight of, even in these testing times. But I will say that the core takeaway was that they know who they serve as institutions and they're focusing on those students. What I appreciate about the data that you've shared with us, it just amplified, I think, for a broader public, the things that we've known for a long time about, pervasive inequities in our economy, in our education. But it's now more public. And what we saw in our fora with institutions was that they weren't waiting for others to take action. They were doing something about it. And that entrepreneurial quality that I mentioned that stood out to me when you saw the small businesses, we heard that repeatedly from institutions. We also saw that sense of community. They wanted to share and they wanted to hear what other institutions were doing. And they had no qualms saying, I'm gonna take that idea, I'm gonna implement that. Can I follow up with you to see what's happening? And I think that's a sign of a community that's willing to figure a lot of this out on their own and make sure that that mentality and approach of figuring out and making solutions happen, that was evident in our institutions. The other is frankly the worry and the concern. Some of those inequities like bandwidth, like others, I think might speak to some of this online challenge. I mean, you said 47% were interested in online, but 33% were wanting to do it in person. We know that there are significant bandwidth and technology limitations. We heard that from the institutions, trying to get laptops to students, trying to get hotspots for students so they could continue their education. And that spoke to me a little bit about this connection. And I guess the other part is it's not explicit there, but I think this issue of worry, and your data showed 72% of the community were worried in some way, shape, or form. We heard that in our forum as well, that many of these Latino students live in multi-generational households where it's not just about them, but it's also their grandparents, their parents who might be more physically vulnerable to this virus than they might. And a fear that students might not want to go out in public and engage, even if and when we pass this, for fear of protecting their family, and how institutions are going to have to adjust and adapt to that reality in addition to the bandwidth and these other components. And to me, to see the data reflect some of what we heard, problem solving, but also acknowledging challenges seemed very consistent.
Well, you jumped right into the next question I was going to pose to all of you, just around, one of the findings here where we do see similarities is this preference for online. Dave and Nicole, I know you've been tracking this in various ways pre-COVID. Would you speak to some of those findings? And then Brian, I'd love to get your kind of reaction to that finding as well.
Yeah, two things. We looking at data from a year ago and asking people on a 5-year horizon how likely they were to enroll in different pathways into education. And looking at that now, there's been a 10-point percentage decrease in people's interest in employer-based education. So they're looking less to employers for those additional courses and training. But what we've seen is everything else has shifted up, but online has jumped up 10 percentage points in terms of people's long-term likelihood to look at online. So the preferences has definitely shifted, with employers being formerly one of the more preferred pathways, and that shrinking and now pushing out to online. So it's consistent. The other thing to know is this is a rapid response. As Brian said, some data is better than no data, and we've just tried to get it out to you as quickly as we can so that you have something. But we also are in the field with our partner Gallup on an address-based sampling, mail out a postcard, mail out a booklet, go to a website, but something that will give people opportunities to answer a deeper battery of questions. And we expect that to come back from a national sample of 10,000 people at the end of June. So in July, we'll have a deeper look at, before and after, but in this interim period where the public is really absorbing. And, even within the last week, we shifted by 10 percentage points the number of people who thought this would last less than 6 months, on the impact on them personally. A week ago, it was 70% of people. This week, it was 60% of the people. So I think the realities are still settling in, and then looking to what does that mean? Is it online because it's all that's available, or is it online because it's preferred in other ways? But we've definitely seen the interest in online, particularly amongst adults who are seeking additional education. That online modality has been there even over the past year in our research.
Mm-hmm. Brian, maybe before we jump over to you, one question that's popping up, I'll try to incorporate as many of the audience Q&A because there's a lot of great things in here. But maybe Deborah, for you, going back even to the town hall, one of the questions someone had was, in the numbers looking at both in-person versus online, do we know if the higher preference among Latino populations is due potentially to language barriers? And I'm curious if that's anything that you've heard in your conversations.
So that's interesting. I mean, in our forum, at least the language did not come up as an issue for the students themselves. The conversation was a little bit more about the families and the ability for them to be supportive of the students and knowing the information at the level they needed to from a language perspective. But it didn't come up a great deal, frankly. I think this was more bandwidth and hotspot access. We know with research that Latinos who go on the internet often are doing something from their phone, even more than hotspots or Wi-Fi at their houses, and the adjustment to that it has been large. And it's not. It's relatively expensive to have a laptop and a computer at home in a multi-generational context. So unfortunately for the forum, the conversation was much more about that than language per se. So I can't answer that other than what we talked about in the forum.
Yeah.
And Deborah, I would say that we're experiencing the same thing at our member institutions. 37 HBCUs that we work with is the issue of access. The digital divide definitely manifests itself in ways where students are, they might not have Wi-Fi access or solid or strong Wi-Fi access at home, and or they don't have, or they're trying to write a report on their phones or access some data on their phones. And so I think that's where we see the digital divide manifesting itself more prominently these days as well.
We have a question here from Kathy Gerchik from SHRM. She's wondering if the data indicate the sectors where Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans are impacted due to reduced shifts or hours. And there's a few other questions, Dave, around kind of how might we be parsing this out by industry. I know that's on the roadmap, so if you want to speak to that for a minute.
Nicole, since she does all the work in that data set, probably deserves the glory of answering the question. Nicole?
Sure. Yes, that was actually the first place that our mind went to as well, was, well, then, the industries that people are working in, help to explain that. We will be taking a look at industry probably 2 weeks from now. It's just with some of our current sample size to do both race, ethnicity, and industry at the same time is kind of pushing the sample size limits a bit, but we will be taking a look at that in a couple of weeks, and then also probably pulling in some other data sources that we can look at. You know, census has good information in terms of what occupations people are in by race, ethnicity, and so we can look at some of that as well to try to pull some of that apart.
Great.
Anna, you'd asked me a question about the responses about that Blacks and Latinos were least likely to prefer online. Yeah. Which, you know, that I don't know if Nicole, I don't know who's controlling the slides, but if you could go back to 1 or 2 slides, I think it's interesting to that one, or yes, this one. And so I think what's interesting here, I think it's the nature of data. We have a tendency to look at one end of the spectrum or the other, because yes, Blacks and Latinos are more likely to prefer in-person education. However, they're also more likely to prefer online education as well. So I think what's promising there is that the latter, actually Blacks were most likely to prefer online education. But the idea that helping people to understand that the future of learning is online and self-directed. I've done some work with Knowledge Works, and I know that they promote a lot of this conversation about the future of learning and self-directed learning. And I think that we have to help. I think that's where our colleges and universities and our K-12 system has to come into play and work together collaboratively to help those populations, in low-income populations, and populations that are affected more dramatically by the socioeconomics of this country. Help them understand, expose them, because I think often exposure is the key. They often don't get the same kind of exposure as early in their schooling, but then also help to address some of the issues that Deborah and I were talking about earlier around broadband access, Wi-Fi access, access to appropriate electronic tools and what have you that allow them to embrace online learning more. Because I think that the more exposure that these populations have to online learning, I think you will see those numbers shift dramatically. And who knows how the current situation we find ourselves in will help to shift those numbers more dramatically. I won't be surprised if that changes by the end of this survey at the end of May.
Yeah, and just to Brian's point, the end, we anticipate weekly through the end of May, but at least monthly into October and beyond, depending on the pace and the dynamic nature of what's happening. We want to help you as a field and all of us understand these shifts and what settles in and what the realities become as people have had these experiences, and what campuses and other providers are even able to offer going forward.
Yeah. Thank
you, Brian.
Can I just link to that too? Because I do think that it's interesting when then you juxtapose that to this point about Latinos and Asian Americans interested in more education and training because of the loss and the potential of linking one with the other. I don't know what went into this background, but I do know that, if online seems like the only option in K-12 and higher ed right now, and whether that informed that thinking, but what are the opportunities we have as institutions and as policymakers and funders, and looking at this point that, almost 40% of Hispanics who responded are thinking they need more education and training. And what does that mean for our ability to provide and be very intentional in reaching out to them to make sure they get that education they're interested in? And how does that conflict with our current structure? And how can we seize that opportunity? I think those are questions we should be asking as we continue to think about these data and the students we're trying to serve.
And Deborah, when I saw that initially, my initial thought was, I wonder if this is influenced, the country, when we go into harsh economic times, people go back to school. So I wonder if that was influencing some of those responses, whether or not people feel as though, oh, unemployment's about to shoot rocket up and people losing their jobs left and right. So I need to go back to school and get some more education and credentials. So you would think that if that were the case, you would think those numbers would be high across the board, but they weren't. So who knows? I'm sure there's some noise in the data there.
Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience from Cheston McGuire from Opportunity at Work, asking if we have this broken down by education level. So Dave and Nicole, I know previously we've looked at some of different responses by education level. I know, what are you finding here?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that was something that we spent a bit more time on in the first webinar. But we do find what's been kind of unique about this crisis is that it has impacted people across education levels. And so when it comes to worry about losing a job or actual impact, we've seen people in the full spectrum having these impacts. So even, people with bachelor's degrees or higher have been laid off or, losing income, things like that. And also have really high perspective in terms of their need for education. So we've definitely been seeing across education levels more consistency than disparity. I think the one place that we've seen more distinction is just the type of education that people would seek. And so people with lower levels are looking more towards the community colleges, whereas people with higher levels are looking to colleges and universities. And you do see a little bit more hesitancy or lower preference for online among the people with less than a high school education. So we do need to keep in mind that there are some distinctions there, whether it's comfort or access or things like that.
And I think when you intersect that with what we know about Latino and African American populations, we're much more likely to be at that educational attainment level, less than high school or up through, I think 23% of Latino adults have an associate degree or higher, which is significantly less than others. So it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, and Deborah, we've been looking at this data and kind of the intimidation. I saw a note from Kim Hunter-Reid, who Kim and I have talked several times, but never about my prior career as a clinical psychologist on the faculty at a counseling and career center at a university, and that impact for mental health. But as we've looked at adults who are aspiring to go back to school, just as real as their fears have been, and this is a different study and body of research, their fears about, can I pay for it? Their fears about, am I cut out to succeed in the classroom? Will I be able to do it and make it, not just juggle everything in their lives, but academically perform their concern. So that anxiety about that they're experiencing just about the academic dimension of education and training, much less about the ability to support and sustain that with income coming in the door and meeting the demands of all the, Deborah, earlier today, you talked about opportunity costs for people who are hungry for education and training and advancement, but the realities of families who are depending upon them and wanting to provide a better life for their children than they've had themselves, and all those things roll into it. So I think, whether it's online or in person, those who are best at it find ways to serve those individuals who are worrying and need the wraparound supports and the encouragement to get over the hurdle and realize that some of these challenges of education are universal and not because they in some way are falling short or inadequate and not up to those tasks.
Yeah, I do think that, we've been doing some work with Kale and looking at Latino adult learners, and this point very much comes out, and looking at what can institutions do to make sure that they are better serving these adults overall, but Latino adults as a specific subset of that. And we were seeing some of what you mentioned there, Dave. I think the added part is from an institutional perspective, the acknowledgement that there's a certain amount of high touch that's needed for folks who don't necessarily feel comfortable with the system and the approach in higher ed because they've not been a part of it. And then on top of that, that they're juggling multiple responsibilities with the fact that often adult education is not core and center mission, that we're often focused on that traditional college age student. And I think some of what works very well for our adults and Latino adults could work for more traditional age. We just don't tend to have a lot of that conversation. But we're seeing a lot of interest and commitment by institutions to try and do more, and acknowledging that they have to serve our adults in a more rigorous and robust way.
Well, Dave, you gave a shout out to Kim Hunter-Reed. I think we have a question from Kim actually right now. So good segue there. What are the implications on access to mental health, or particularly higher ed institutions are playing a really important role in serving students' mental health? What are the implications today as everyone's remote?
I didn't know that was. I thought it was a directed question, not a rhetorical one. Deborah, you're gonna. It sounds like
I would just say, again, that's not my area of expertise, but in our forum, in talking with institutions over the last 3.5, 4 weeks, there's just a realization here that I don't think institutions had sufficient mental health support for the students who were on campuses already, and there was a strain and a struggle there. And I think every single institution we've talked to since has mentioned the need to figure out how to provide better mental health support, not just for their students, but for their faculty and for their staff. Some of it speaks to some of your data about worry, but also the uncertainty and having to adjust and adapt to an online structure and to a lot of unknowns, and that institutions are being challenged to figure out how to provide sufficient support, especially now that they're having to do it virtually. I haven't heard lots of solutions. I've heard an acknowledgement of need. So again, I apologize, that's not an area of an expertise of mine, but we are hearing the recognition that we need to be doing more.
And I concur with that. I would, I know that we have some internal data from some of our students where we've, some of our scholarship recipients, and we award upwards of $10,000 a year almost. And so with any cohort at any given time, we've awarded scholarships to tens of thousands of students looking at a 4-year cohort. And so we did a recent survey asking them about their concerns. The number one, if I remember right, the number one thing that they were concerned about, almost half the students requesting assistance around managing mental health related to the pandemic. And so I do think I agree with Deborah that very few campuses, almost no campus out there has a counseling center that's fully equipped to handle all the students that they need to work with. And so this is just going to exacerbate that, because students are stressed out, and especially for students at the institutions that we work with, where over 70% of the students are Pell eligible, and those students and their families are being disproportionately hit by the crisis, by this pandemic. And so, should we be doing more about mental health? We definitely need to have more attention to that, and there needs to be more of a concerted effort by institutions, by states, by networks, whether they're private institutions or different institutional types. And so I do think that mental health issues will be something that has been an underlying conversation in higher ed for the last, for a while. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about it, and so we don't put it in the forefront, but it's something that's definitely going to have to be addressed in a more intentional way moving forward.
Yeah, and I'd say with some cultural responsiveness and awareness to it as well, which is an added dimension when you look at Hispanic serving institutions and those that are looking to serve our population, specifically African American and Latino.
Yeah, Strata has been fortunate to partner with the Jackie Robinson Foundation, and I attended their annual scholars meeting a couple years ago, and it was striking. It was that horrible snowstorm that shut down Amtrak and transportation, and speakers couldn't get in. So they just opened up the room to these scholars who'd come from all across the nation. And they started talking about the mental health challenges and the feelings they were having. But the peer validation and network that had been created for them was a great strength. And so that's something that we can lean into. I know budgets and funds will be tight on campuses, but if we can model dialogues and mobilize the peer support and networks of people who want to come together and share, I think that'll be important and validating. I've seen that work in my own professional past life to engage students helping one another when resources are scarce is healthy in lots of ways. But Jenna, maybe we
we've got a few more questions.
Yeah.
We can squeeze everyone in, but we have a question from Doug Shapiro that says, he asks, it looks like Black and Latino Americans are simply less likely to prefer employer-provided education, which could be an effect of experience with lower wage employment and employers that wouldn't be expected to provide education. What are you seeing in those differences? Any thoughts on that?
I think, hi Doug, I would say, that makes sense in some of it. I think the other is your data showed this issue of small businesses and lost income and wages. So I do think that being part of the blue collar, but also that we tend to be very entrepreneurial. And these small businesses, they themselves can be the employer. And so I think in addition to what was just shared, that the recognition that we have, that we are represented in small businesses that don't have large income bases, I would add that to the comments.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where I want to know more about the data set and who's actually surveyed, because if there are, I think Deborah's absolutely right. If we've got a large number of people working at small businesses, they probably say that my small business can't even afford to let me take a class or take some kind of training, or that what training is offered is almost non-existent. So this is the area where I'd want to know more about what people are responding to. Because if you've got a bunch of people who work at, some of the biggest corporations in the country or in the world, and they still don't provide, don't prefer employer training, then I think that's a different conversation that I'd want to dig into more, especially when, Tony Carnevale in his shop shows that, employers are spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on training. And so, yeah, I think we want to dig a little deeper into the data, understand that.
For sure. And I think those private sector employer dollars, I think it's 70% that go into upper level people with bachelor's degrees. So it's not the front line and bring people up. It's people who are already and they're advancing into other areas. So that part of how do employers engage and support is really a question. And I think it merits some additional exploration and questioning. Right now, our question is, if you had $5,000 to invest in your future education and training, so would you want to invest that in employer-provided on-the-job training, or would you take it to something independent that you identify? And so there's some, all these questions are early signals, I think, to things we need to pay attention to so we can identify the ones that are most important to understand and act upon towards solutions. And so again, this dialogue with all of you participating in the questions you submit, just help us formulate and know what to pursue and which things are going to be most helpful in the immediate response we're all trying to make to this challenge.
Yeah. Can I add to that, Dave? Because I do think the challenge we face, I'm sorry, Nicole, were you going to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was going to just make a small comment that I think Brian makes a great point about maybe the linkages between preferences and expectations, because what we've seen has been the biggest difference between the survey data we had last year and the survey data we have this year is the expectation that employers would, that people would get training through their employers. And so when you ask people how likely they are, that's what's taken the huge hit, really, is people no longer expecting their employers, expecting to enroll in training through their employers. So I think that is reflected in some of this as well.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, part of what, in speaking to the institutions and the communities we've been with the last couple of weeks, that it's sometimes interesting with the data, the cart following horse kind of a thing approach, right? Because so many in our community are not waiting to act, and therefore it's a representation after the fact of some of what they're doing. But I think there's that look for leadership. When is it, what do we know? When do we know enough? And what are we acting on? Are we paying attention to these communities, these communities of color, while we're trying to take actions overall in policy and practice and investments and linking to the workforce? So I do think that these are, you've raised some really good areas for opportunity for action and investment. And I know it's responsive to the groups we're working with, so.
All right, we'll try to get 2 more questions in before we wrap up here. But Deborah, this one's for you from Carrie Locker. She said, you know, she appreciates what you shared about supporting staff in a virtual environment. Do you feel there are more ways training could be offered, not only with higher ed staff on how to work remotely, but also in how to support students remotely?
Absolutely. You know, I find it, I wouldn't say ironic, but interesting that, you know, so many institutions have been, have mentioned being a little bit resistant to change, to transform to the growth population and the different demographics. But if nothing else, in this environment, they've had to shift and shift quickly. And that transformation has yielded and shown a lot of the inequities we didn't think about. And I think we've got to continue to focus on students. We've seen some opportunities using apps where institutions are trying to create that bridge for students to get them educated, informed, and engage them continually. For staff, we are seeing it's different because they need to be engaged. We need to be supporting them, but they're the intermediary in working with students. And so institutions paying attention to what a staff need is going to be absolutely critical, because they are the more direct line connection to students. And I'm just hearing lots of, let's try something, let's listen to our students and faculty and staff and see what we can do. I'm not confident that we know how effective they all are, but I know the intention is strong, and we're going to keep tracking it to see what it will take to serve staff and students better.
Brian, how about yourself? I mean, obviously the findings here are deeply concerning, but I think there may be some bright spots too that people can be learning from. What are you seeing from some of the institutions you're talking to? Have they figured out ways to support students remotely?
Well, I think this is a learning process for everyone involved. And so I think what is being learned, I think is simply being tested. Everything is kind of in a beta stage right now. And so I think that we've seen a couple of institutions that have pivoted well. And actually the institutions that I can think about that have done a good job in trying to move students online more quickly were institutions that were already delivering a good bit of content online. So they already had some muscle there. And I think that this crisis will make everyone essentially go to the gym and build some muscle in their online capabilities. What we see happening is that institutions are also, I think the other piece, the online delivery is one thing, it's where everything is being done online, virtual. And I think that's where institutions are struggling and trying to grasp for straws to figure out what they're supposed to be doing and how to approach this most effectively. So the schools that had some online capability are the ones that are doing a better job with their students. And I think that is a lesson for everyone that this is the area that they need to invest in further in order to prepare for, because we don't know what's going to happen, if this is going to come back again next fall, or if this is going to be a longer term play than what we realize. So investing in online capability, to me, is the big lesson that will serve institutions well moving forward. Whether or not there's a vaccine tomorrow, this can prepare them well for what might eventually come 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road as well.
I think for sure we're going to have to think differently, and yes, and making sure that our students of color and those who serve them are more front and center, because they are the bellwethers. I hope that's the case as we continue doing this work forward.
Well, Deborah, that's a good closing thought there. So thank you, everyone. Are you mindful of folks' time? Thank you so much for joining us. We will have our next webinar will be next Wednesday, the 29th. Dave's kind of alluded to some of the data that we're thinking about breaking down, but we'll be sharing more later in the coming days. But Brian, Deborah, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Nicole and Dave, thank you as always for your quick work here and bringing these issues to light.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you,
Strata. The website is right here, but that's strataeducation.org/public viewpoint. All right. Thank you all. All right. I think we are we off, Kylie?
We've got, not yet.